Do you feel safer now? Or do old wounds still echo sometimes?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I paid for my own surgery while my parents signed the deed to a vacation house for my brother, and then they looked at me like I was ungrateful when I stopped showing up for family dinners. That single sentence already says more than I ever wanted to admit out loud, because the truth is I carried the weight of those medical bills alone, quietly, while pretending it was fine. While they were out there celebrating Tyler like he had just invented electricity when all he did was exist and wait for them to hand him something shiny. I remember the day I opened the hospital bill, page after page, charges stacked like an impossible staircase, and I sat there calculating which card had enough limit to cover the deposit so they would not send me straight to collections. I thought about calling them, about asking just once if they could step in, but then I remembered the last conversation we had when I hinted at needing help. My mom said, almost rehearsed, "We cannot set that kind of precedent, Maya. We helped you through college, and that's already more than most parents do." My dad added, "We cannot be expected to bankroll adulthood. This is where you stand on your own." It felt final, like the case was closed before I even opened my mouth properly. So I did what anyone does when they have no choice. I cut groceries down to bare minimum. I skipped nights out. I bargained with the billing office. I signed up for a payment plan that felt like another rent bill stacked on my back, and I worked late hours because I needed every overtime check I could get. Meanwhile, I kept hearing about my brother's bad luck streaks, how one job was not a fit, how the next one ended too quickly, how he just needed a fresh start, and how my parents insisted they could not stand by and let him struggle. When I found out about the lake house, it was not even from them directly. My cousin sent me a photo, the whole family standing on a deck with a caption about, "Finally a place to relax." I thought it was just a rental until I saw the comments about them buying Tyler the perfect reset. That was the moment my chest felt hollow, not even angry at first, more like stunned silence, like I was watching some other family play out on screen. What stung was not even the house itself, though let's be real, it stung plenty. It was the absolute double standard. They told me helping me would set a precedent, but apparently precedent did not matter when it was about my brother. When it was me, it was about tough love, independence, responsibility. When it was him, it was about compassion, family unity, second chances. That contrast sat in my throat like acid. I stopped answering group texts as much. I skipped a family errand or two, and I told Ethan, my partner, that I was done pretending everything was balanced. He said what I already knew deep down: they are not confused. They know exactly what they are doing. They are just shocked you stopped playing along. And he was right. Still, I could not shake the urge to show them exactly what I had been carrying, not by screaming, not by begging, but by holding up the mirror. I pulled out my itemized hospital bill, highlighted every denied line, every charge I had been told was non-negotiable, and I attached it in the family chat with one line only, for everyone keeping score. Then I muted the chat. No lecture, no breakdown, no emotional plea, just evidence. Within minutes, I saw the typing bubbles light up. My mom wrote, "Honey, this is not the time to make things ugly. We are celebrating family." My dad chimed in, "You're being dramatic, you have to let things go." Then, as if to prove my point, a new photo appeared, the whole group smiling on the lake deck like it was an advertisement for a perfect family life. The irony was almost laughable. That night, my phone buzzed with a private message from Aunt Rosa. She said, "If you want the truth on paper, I have it. I save everything." I stared at that message longer than I should have, because it meant someone else saw it, someone else had been keeping track. I did not answer right away, but I knew in that moment the story was far from over. The silence in me had turned into resolve. This was not about begging for fairness anymore. This was about rewriting the script of how they expected me to play my role. And if they thought sending me photos from that deck would make me feel excluded, they were about to learn what real exclusion felt like when I started setting boundaries that could not be ignored. By the next morning, I had replayed every word from the chat in my head, not because I wanted to nurse a grudge, but because I finally understood that the way I had been taught to speak to my parents was a script where I apologized first, softened the facts second, and offered to fix the mess third, and if I kept doing that then nothing would ever change, so I made coffee, opened a blank document, and built a timeline that did not need raised voices to land. A simple list with dates, messages, and decisions where I asked for help after the pre-authorization denial, where Linda replied with a warning about setting precedent, where George framed it as adulthood, where I thanked them anyway and took the payment plan, and then, months later, where they posted a deed celebration for Tyler and called it a family milestone. I printed that timeline and slid it into a plain envelope that I labeled, without drama, policy, because if they could turn love into policy when it came to me, then I could return the favor by treating fairness as a policy that demanded receipts, and I carried that envelope with me to Sunday brunch like it was a seatbelt, not because I planned to wave it around, but because I wanted to remember that I was no longer arriving as the daughter who would smooth things over at any cost. When I walked in, the table conversation was already performing normal, with Linda telling a polished story about the lake community and how the previous owners had been family friends, while George added small facts about interest rates as if numbers could scrub the favoritism clean, and Tyler leaned back with that breezy shrug that says consequences are for other people, and for a second I felt the gravitational pull of pretending. The old habit that says smile, nod, pour coffee, and let the chewing noise cover the truth, but Ethan squeezed my hand under the table as if to remind me this is not a courtroom where you beg for leniency. This is your life and your boundary, and so I waited for a natural pause and, without theatrics, I reached across to Aunt Rosa, who was watching me like someone who has sat through this play too many times, and I placed the envelope on her placemat with a quiet, "This is for you," and I watched her eyes settle on the word policy like she already knew what it contained. I did not give it to Linda or George, not to be cruel, but because the point was not to argue with people who denied reality in private and then demanded affection in public. The point was to place the facts where they could not be quietly rewritten. With the family historian who screenshots everything and the cousin who does not confuse politeness with honesty. I did not ask for a forum, I did not ask for a verdict, and I did not launch into a speech, because I have learned that when the story is clear, the loudest person in the room is often the weakest case. So I simply said that I would not be taking on any more family errands, that I would not be managing logistics for group events, and that I was done offering emotional labor in exchange for being called ungrateful when I declined an invitation to pose on the deck I did not help to buy, and then I stood, paid for my own brunch without flinching, and left before anyone could trap me in the phone booth of circular apologies. In the car, I told Ethan that I was not done, not because I craved a fight, but because the pattern ran deeper than one bill and one house, and I wanted to puncture the performance without turning into a tabloid. So that night I set up something my parents would never expect me to do, something painfully boring and completely devastating to the narrative they depended on, which was a calm, free webinar with a nonprofit that helps families navigate open enrollment, medical debt appeals, and equitable support strategies. The kind of presentation where a neutral expert explains that if you give a large financial gift to one adult child under the banner of family unity, the truly unifying thing to do is to provide comparable support or a structured alternative for the other child, and the expert does not need to know your names to make everyone in your family feel the heat. I sent a group invitation to the extended relatives, framed it as education season and resource sharing, and I kept the language clean and inclusive because I wanted bodies in the virtual room more than I wanted the quick hit of saying the lake house out loud. And on the night of the session, I watched the participant squares fill with faces who had laughed on the deck and faces who had stayed quiet in the chat and faces who had texted me privately saying they felt the imbalance, but did not want to get between a daughter and her parents. The presenter walked through employer plans, billing codes, charity care options, and then, with that soft voice that makes people nod even while they are being dismantled, she explained the principle of matched support. How gifts are not only about money but about messages, how a big check to one sibling paired with a moral lecture to the other becomes a story that eventually destroys trust, and how families who care about being remembered as fair implement written guidelines so that no one can pretend confusion later. I did not unmute once, I did not type a single name, and I did not need to, because when the slide appeared about large gifts requiring a balancing mechanism, half the chat lit up with hypotheticals that were not hypothetical at all. The kind of questions that begin with if, in theory, parents deeded a property to one child, and end with a silence that says the theory is sitting on a lake in our state. Linda's square vanished midway through. George's microphone flickered like he could not decide whether to talk or pretend the connection failed, and Tyler started texting me directly with the kind of bravado that dissolves into guilt halfway through a sentence. First calling me dramatic, then asking if I wanted to make mom cry, then pivoting into a clumsy offer to work something out, which sounded less like accountability and more like keeping the rental plan clean, because he knew there were association rules he had already bragged about breaking in private chats. I read the messages and did not answer, not because I was playing hard to get, but because this was not about a side deal or a hush payment. This was about finally making the system visible enough that I could step away without being called cruel for refusing to donate my piece to a performance. After the webinar ended, Danny called to say that the cousins were stunned into a useful kind of silence, the kind that makes people replay the reels in their head and realize the background music has always been manipulation dressed as tradition. And she asked me what I wanted to happen next, not in a dreamy way but in a practical one, and I told her that I wanted my parents to pick a lane, either admit the double standard and rebuild trust with clear commitments, or keep the double standard and stop asking me to decorate it, and that until they made that choice I would stop translating their confusion for them. When I finally put my phone down, it buzzed again, and this time it was Tyler, who had managed to move past the bravado into a tone I recognized from his childhood when a coach finally said no. And he wrote a single line that told me he had felt the ground move under his feet, a question that did not accuse and did not pretend, a question that said he knew this was no longer about winning an argument. What are you planning? When Tyler sent that message asking what I was planning, I stared at it for a long while because it was the first time he admitted, even indirectly, that something real was happening, that the family script was being interrupted, and that he no longer felt protected by the usual chorus of excuses. I did not respond, because the point was never to satisfy his curiosity or reassure him that nothing would come of his actions, but to build something that would last beyond one dramatic conversation. I realized that if my parents wanted to treat fairness as an abstract concept, and if Tyler wanted to treat accountability as optional, then I would simply step outside the whole system of unspoken rules and use the only kind of language they could not distort: paperwork, records, and boundaries written in ways that did not require tone or mood to be understood. The first step was locking down my own stability. I froze my credit so that no desperate relative could ever try to use my name as a safety net. I called the hospital billing office again and asked to appeal part of my charges, not because I believed the system was suddenly fair, but because I knew persistence with institutions works better than begging parents who had already chosen their favorite child. After weeks of back and forth, I managed to secure partial relief through a charity care review, and though it did not erase everything, it shaved down a chunk of the balance in a way that felt more validating than any half-apology check my parents might have offered out of guilt. That relief letter, official and stamped, became a new piece of armor because it reminded me that my survival had been built on my own effort, not their selective generosity. Once I had that in hand, I turned to the records that actually told the story no one wanted to say out loud. Public property deeds are easy enough to pull if you know how, and with a few clicks I had a clean PDF showing the exact date my parents transferred ownership of the lake house to Tyler, the signatures, and the tax records that spelled out not just generosity but intention. I did not print it to shove in their faces. I saved it for myself, because seeing it in black and white closed the door on any future attempt to tell me I had exaggerated or misremembered. That document was the family truth stripped of sentiment, and I knew it would be my quiet card to play whenever they claimed confusion about my distance. I also started drawing hard lines in the way I interacted with them. I mailed a notarized letter to my parents that laid out boundaries in simple, unemotional terms. All requests for help would need to be in writing. I would consider them quarterly. And I would not be available for last-minute emergencies that always seemed to fall to me while Tyler remained curiously unavailable. I was not asking permission, and I was not threatening to cut them off, but I was refusing to play the role of default caretaker in a family where my own needs had been dismissed. Ethan read the letter before I mailed it and told me it was the coldest and most honest thing I had ever written, and that was exactly the point. When Linda texted again asking why I was being so distant, I did not launch into paragraphs of explanation. Instead, I replied with a single link to the county deed index and the line, "Because this is what family looks like here." I knew it would land like a stone in her stomach, not because she did not know what she had done, but because she never expected me to point directly to the evidence and refuse to dress it up in polite excuses. She did not reply that night, and the silence said more than any lecture could have. Not long after, Danny sent me a screen recording from a cousin's group chat where Tyler was bragging about renting out the lake house on weekends, cash only, claiming no one would ever check, because the community rules were not enforced. He laughed about it like it was clever, while also complaining that the taxes were high, as if he had earned the right to complain about free property that most people could only dream of. Watching him gloat made me realize that my parents had not only rewarded him for mediocrity, but had set him up to exploit the gift further without accountability. It was the kind of arrogance that always unravels eventually, but this time, I was not going to stand on the sidelines quietly. I began pulling the homeowners association documents, not to report him immediately, but to know the rules better than he did. I highlighted the section about short-term rentals being prohibited, and I tucked it alongside the deed and my medical bills in a growing folder I labeled Equity. That folder was not just paperwork, it was my case file against the entire charade. For the first time, I felt like I was the one writing the family narrative instead of being trapped in it, and I knew the next moves would not be about confrontation at the dinner table, but about letting the truth press down on them in ways they could not spin away. Tyler's bragging gave me leverage I had not expected, and the knowledge that he was flaunting rules in a way that could embarrass my parents publicly turned into both a weapon and a shield. I did not rush to use it, because I wanted the weight of anticipation to grow, but I knew that when the moment came, I could tip the scales without raising my voice. For once, the evidence was stacked in my favor, and the only question left was how far I was willing to push it before they realized that the daughter they had dismissed as dramatic had learned to play their own game better than they ever imagined. And when I closed the folder that night, I caught myself smiling, not because the situation was fair, not because the pain had faded, but because for the first time in years, I felt in control of how the story would end. And that was something none of them could take back. When I had finally collected the paperwork, the notarized letters, the deed records, the hospital relief notices, and even the homeowners association rules, I understood that silence would no longer serve me. Because my parents thrived on the unspoken arrangement where I carried my own burdens in private while they curated an image of family unity in public, so if anything was ever going to shift, I had to let the truth breathe in the very spaces where they polished their reputation the most. I did not need to stage a screaming match, and I did not need to humiliate them with theatrics, because the more powerful strategy was simply to let others see what had been hiding behind the polished front, and to do it in such a way that no one could accuse me of inventing drama. That was how I decided to make reputation the next battleground, not through gossip or outbursts, but by placing carefully chosen truths in places where they could not be ignored or distorted. The opportunity came faster than I expected when I received a polite letter from the Lake Community Association, which had been copied to new owners, about upcoming orientation sessions. I called and asked, very calmly, for a copy of the rental policy, framing it as a concern for keeping things orderly. And within days the document arrived in my inbox with highlighted passages about prohibitions against short-term rentals and penalties for violations. I printed that section and slipped it into the same folder that already contained Tyler's bragging texts. Without saying a word to him, I forwarded the official policy to my father, attaching only the line, "In case you want to keep the family's image clean." I also copied Aunt Rosa, because I wanted it clear that my intent was not vindictive but preventative, and once the information was visible, no one could pretend they did not know. The association responded by thanking me for being proactive, even offering a slot for a new owner. Orientation, which I never intended to attend but knew my parents would see as a subtle spotlight being turned on them. That single email carried more weight than hours of arguments ever could, because now they were on record with people whose approval they actually cared about. At the same time, I began controlling my own narrative in a way they could not edit or erase. I posted a short note on my page, not dramatic, not even directed at them, but layered with meaning. Here is what happens in the first 24 hours after you stop auditioning for your parents. Beneath it, I attached a cropped image of my charity care approval letter, with personal identifiers covered, thanking the hospital social worker who had guided me through the process. No names of my family were included, no accusations spelled out, yet the contrast was unmistakable. People saw a daughter forced to fight for medical relief on her own, and they saw gratitude to a stranger rather than to the parents who were supposed to step in. Comments flooded in, supportive, validating, and sharply critical of the kind of parents who would let that happen. None of my relatives could accuse me of slander, because all I had done was state my own story and share an official letter. The power of reputation is that sometimes you do not need to point fingers. You simply hold up the mirror and let people gasp on their own. It did not take long for the ripple to reach back to Linda, who prided herself on being the smiling face of family pride at church and in her community groups. The carefully manicured image of generous parents was cracking under the weight of undeniable contrast, and when people began asking gentle but pointed questions about fairness, she panicked. My father showed up unannounced one evening, holding an envelope like a peace offering. Inside was a check that covered part of my outstanding balance, and a note scribbled with the words, "Let's put this behind us." He stood in my doorway looking like a man who wanted me to make it easy, who wanted me to be grateful enough to accept a token gesture and erase the past months of selective generosity. But I handed the envelope back and told him, without anger but with a finality I had never managed before, "That is not the debt I am collecting." He did not argue, because for once he had no counter, and I closed the door on both him and the gesture. What made the moment powerful was not the refusal of money, but the statement it carried, that the real debt was never about hospital bills or property transfers, but about honesty, fairness, and the way love had been weaponized into a reward for one child and a lecture for the other. By walking away from the check, I made it impossible for them to frame me as bitter about cash, because I had just declined the very thing they thought would pacify me. It forced them to confront the fact that my distance was not transactional, it was structural. Meanwhile, Danny continued feeding me screenshots from cousin chats, and each one showed how the perception of my parents was shifting. Some relatives began questioning why Tyler deserved constant rescues, while others wondered aloud whether my parents had been harder on me precisely because I was competent enough to survive without their help. The conversations were uncomfortable, messy, and filled with speculation, but I did not interfere because the point was never to manage the narrative. The point was to release it. My parents were learning what it felt like to have people look at them with raised eyebrows, and that lesson was more effective than any confrontation I could stage on my own. By the time the next family gathering rolled around, the air was different. My mother avoided eye contact, my father kept quiet, and Tyler tried to overcompensate with jokes that fell flat. I did not need to call them out or raise my voice, because the silence of others spoke louder than anything I could have said. And when I left early, refusing to stay and smooth things over, no one followed me to the door with accusations. They all understood something had shifted permanently. For the first time in my life, I was not the one shrinking or apologizing. I was the one holding the mirror steady, and they were the ones who had to decide whether they could stand to look at their own reflection. The power of reputation is that once it turns, no amount of denial can pull it back, and I knew, as I walked away from that gathering, that I had finally stepped out of the shadow of their selective love and into the clarity of my own terms. By the time I reached the point where there was nothing left to collect but dignity, I understood that the only way to finish this story was not through another confrontation or another carefully dropped piece of evidence, but through a permanent act that could not be rewritten by excuses, denials, or selective memory. My parents had made it clear that they wanted the narrative of family pride to stay intact as long as no one forced them to acknowledge the cracks, but I had already stopped playing the part of the quiet daughter who absorbed unfairness for the sake of harmony. The question was no longer whether I would forgive them or whether they would apologize, because both of those depended on performances I no longer trusted. The real question was how I could close the chapter with a move that guaranteed the rules would never again be dictated by their shifting loyalties. I began by meeting with an estate planner, not because I had vast wealth to distribute, but because I wanted the little I had, and the much more I planned to build, to be protected by principles rather than guilt. I explained to the planner that my parents had gifted a property to my brother while denying me help with essential medical bills, and that I wanted my will to contain an equity clause so that no beneficiary could ever receive a major gift without an equal or proportional provision being offered to the others. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he nodded with the kind of respect people give when they realize you are not simply angry, but determined to leave a structure behind. Together we drafted a family equity rule that stated in plain language, if one heir receives a gift, others must receive something comparable, or the gift will be redirected to a patient relief fund. It was clean, unemotional, and devastatingly fair, the exact opposite of the environment I had been raised in. With the paperwork signed, I felt lighter, as if a weight I had carried for decades had finally been set down, not because the past had been fixed, but because the future no longer belonged to the rules of favoritism. I wrote letters to accompany the documents, not full of bitterness or blame, but factual explanations of why I had chosen this path. I said, I will not explain this again. Fairness is no longer a request, it is a condition. I sealed those letters and placed them in the same folder where I had stored the deeds and the hospital bills, and I labeled it not with sarcasm, but with the word legacy. Then, with deliberate calm, I made a donation to a medical debt relief nonprofit, using money that could have gone toward something indulgent for myself, and I dedicated it in my parents' honor with the line, "For every daughter told." We cannot set that precedent. The confirmation letter arrived within days, stamped with the nonprofit seal, and I copied it into the packet that I mailed to my parents. There was no room for misinterpretation. In one envelope, they held the documents of my new estate plan, the receipt of a donation that framed their excuse as the very reason I had chosen to give elsewhere, and the simple message that I was done begging for equity because I had written it into the bones of my future. When Linda called after receiving the packet, her voice trembled, but she did not cry, and for once she did not start with a lecture about family pride. She asked me, almost gently, if there was any way to repair what had happened without buying anyone anything. It was the first time she had spoken without hiding behind property deeds, excuses, or the phrase, "That's just how families work." I told her that the only way forward was for her to say what really happened, not to me in private, but openly, without hiding behind phrases or pretending confusion. She went silent, and I let the silence stretch, because I had learned that silence can be sharper than any argument when you refuse to fill it with explanations. In the following weeks, I pulled back from the constant storm of family messages and gatherings, and I built my own rhythm of peace. I went to work without the ache of double standards gnawing at my chest. I paid my bills without resentment, and I planned my future without imagining whether my parents would approve. Tyler continued to use the lake house, and I did not interfere, because it no longer mattered to me whether he followed the rules or broke them. What mattered was that I had shifted the balance of power, not by punishing him directly, but by ensuring that no future could be shaped entirely by the same favoritism that had once left me gasping for air. At the next holiday dinner, the air was subdued. My parents avoided grand speeches, Tyler kept his bragging to a minimum, and relatives who had once ignored the imbalance watched the table with curiosity, as if waiting to see whether the performance would resume. I stayed calm, polite, and distant, and when the evening ended, I left with my head high, no longer needing to justify my choices. I knew that the story had turned not because they had changed, but because I had refused to keep auditioning for a role that never served me. The final move was not dramatic or cruel, it was clean, clever, and permanent. I had turned their own logic into my shield, written my rules into the only documents that could not be spun away, and ensured that fairness would live in my legacy even if it never thrived in theirs. As I closed the door on that chapter, I did not feel guilty or vengeful. I felt finished, and that was the victory I had been reaching for all along.